Hello. I've been thinking a bit um, about doing something. I guess you could say doing something or returning to something um, for the career and vocational practitioners in the audience. As some of you know, um, that's kind of where I started out. Pretty significant part of my career. My career has always been dedicated um, to healing, if you will, to working with people who are experiencing chronic kinds of issues. And one of the areas that I explored earlier in my career was chronic unemployment. Um, there was a period of time very early in my life where I got curious about what was going on in my own employment history. And while that was going on, I was taking some courses that were more in the area of transpersonal and depth psychology that really helped me see more deeply into what was going on for me. And once I started to gain more insight and work through some of those things that were brought to mind for me, brought into my awareness, I was able to, if you will, crack the code um, and not have to deal with uh, unemployment issues and just glitches in employment. Um, that being said, I was still also a counselor while that was going on, and had some work going on in private practice. And I began to see more and more people coming into my groups uh, that were experiencing issues around unemployment. And this wasn't just people who you could say didn't have skill. Many of these people had college degrees, were highly educated, highly skilled, but their issue was that they couldn't keep a job. So they were kind of chronically unemployed due to being unable to maintain employment. Other people, of course, are just can't seem to manage to get a job or um, or find employment that isn't necessarily uh, a job that will help them sustain a lifestyle. Um, but anyway, that began to be my focus for a long time, the area of chronic unemployment. Um, Now, again, being a counselor, um, alongside that, my passions were very much into depth psychology, into trauma, um, and I began to bring those two worlds together. The curiosity, of course, was how does trauma impact employability? Now, many of you know as well that I share a lot on one of the areas of my passion is looking at the, I guess you could say, inflated sense of entitlement and indulgence that has really begun to show up in our society in the last couple of decades. And so for the last 20 years, I have made that a significant area of study as well. And so beginning to look at chronic unemployment or employability issues as connected to trauma, and then as connected to an issue of entitlement and indulgence. And so that became really the three dots that I was wanting to connect at that particular period of time. Now, one of the things that has emerged, probably over the last 5 years especially, is this idea of being trauma informed. So that word or title uh, is being used quite a bit, um, not only in terms of how people do their work, but how systems and agencies are designed, and how and their policies and procedures, if they reflect a trauma-informed approach. Now, the area of trauma, the study of trauma, is huge, and it can be studied from a lot of different perspectives. Um, and And so my approach on this for today's discussion, what I'm going to share with you, is more from that depth psychology, entitlement, and indulgence phenomena that we see going on. Um, but that being said, um, yeah, bringing together all this information um, has been of great importance. And so I want to, I guess you could say, put it out there, ask if you're a, uh, a career practitioner or employment specialist, career advisor, vocational consultant, or rehabilitation specialist. Um, if you're if you see yourself coming from a trauma-informed approach. Now, one of the things about trauma is, or about a lot of things, but I'll say this about trauma, is that, obviously this is not a new thing. It's been happening since the beginning of time. And there have been lots of discussions already on the areas of trauma and its impact on a person's ability to function in life. To me, that's kind of an old discussion. And how I feel about it is that we should be moving, we should be evolving our conversations, or what we can call elevating our conversations. We want to move these conversations into different paradigms. I mean, it was Einstein who said you can never solve a problem in the same paradigm in which it was created. So, for instance, for me to, I guess you could say, put a dent in this issue of chronic unemployment, that issue, I really wanted to look at that from a different paradigm. The traditional paradigm of unemployment, really it can be arranged anything from, providing people with kind of basic life skills on how to manage their time and money and how to do, take care of themselves, what clothes to wear, all sorts of tips and things on how to conduct a successful job search, how to be successful in an interview, um, all that, and then provide people with some incentives. So maybe a clothing allowance, some certificates and things like this that people can get, first aid, WMIS, things like that. Um, that's all pretty traditional. Now, let me just kind of pause here for a second and kind of, I want to draw you back to a little bit of my career. A while back, you may have heard of the Baristas Youth Skills Link program. That program got off the ground in 2003, but it began, as a thought and and putting in the framework from 2001 to 2003. I was fortunate enough to be hired, to be invited to be the supervisor of that program, which I was for 7 years. Um, Now, what was interesting about that, and if you've ever been in this kind of arena, this field, you know that it can unfortunately be pretty normal for agencies to receive contracts and the funds at short notice, and then you're called to to put together a program pretty quickly and begin to promote and get people into the seats. This particular program, a skills link program, is for youth, at-risk youth at the particular time. Now, we had gotten the money, won the contract, and of course the federal government wanted this program running yesterday. So we didn't have a lot of time for the kind of promotion that we would have liked to have done, etc. But we did manage to get 10 youth into the seats. So we didn't get the cream of the crop by any means. There was all sorts of challenges that the youth presented, everything from from drug addiction to mental health issues to homelessness to domestic issues, criminal histories, etc. All that one would expect within that population. Um, and it was a program where youth were receiving minimum wage to be in the program, and I think at that time the life skills component was going to be 9 weeks, and there was an internship component with Starbucks for 14 weeks. So that program started out was a significant period of time. I think all in all, it was almost 6 months long in a cycle. Um, so again, coming in at the 11th hour, as the contract did, um, it afforded me the opportunity to bring in a curriculum that I created called the empowerment philosophy and the integrity model, and the integrity approach. Now, let me just make a long story short here. This program still exists today. Again, it started in 2003. I was with it for 6, 7 years. Um, Now, as the program gained more notoriety, um, it became more well known. There was requests for replication from all over the place, which was a good thing, except for it began to pull me away from the direct facilitation role. So I was also training facilitators, and I was always also the lead facilitator within the group. Um, so as the program expanded and I was called away to train more facilitators and get more programs off the ground, I was spending less time doing the facilitation in the classroom. But here's what generally the outcomes looked like. In that very first group, all we had was the minimum wage. There were no other bells and whistles. There were no other certificates. There was no clothing allowance. There was no completion bonus. None of it. It was just the minimum wage being offered. That being said as well, we didn't have a chance to really have the kind of pool of applicants that we wanted to draw from. So we had some really significant barriers in that group. But we did fill all 10 of the seats. And at the end of that program, at the end of that cycle, 10 out of 10 participants graduated from the program. Of those 10, 7 of them were offered employment with Starbucks. I think also out of the 10, I think it was 9 of them got employment. So 7 got employment directly with Starbucks. 2 more got employment elsewhere. And I think there was a significant portion that also returned to high school as a result of the program and their participation. Now, that was in the very first cycle. Now, the targeted outcome was going to be measured 90 days after program completion. There was, I think it was 60 to 70% employment. We had 90% employment even before the program ended. Those statistics and outcomes had never been achieved before. This was a first-of-the-kind program where a nonprofit agency was able to partner with a for-profit Fortune 500 company who had zero tolerance for any issues, any problems. Working with a group of at-risk youth, most of them who never worked before. All of them had come from traumatized backgrounds, histories of trauma. So we were able to create that kind of outcome. Now, as the cycles continued to be offered, what happened is that the outcomes actually reduced. So as I was pulled away from the program and was unable to deliver the integrity model, the depth psychology model of it, as succinctly as I would have liked, the outcomes actually started to go down. Instead of graduating 10 out of 10, we had 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10. Now, that's still within acceptable norms. But what happened is that as these outcomes, if you will, went down, the traditional response to that was to add more incentives. So then what you saw was a life skills program, first of all, that got shortened. So from 9 weeks of life skills, it went down to 6 weeks. From 14 weeks of internship, it went down to 10 weeks. So they shortened the program, and then they also added incentives. And I say they, it was kind of the governmental, traditional response to seeing what was going on with the outcomes. So now the youth were getting first aid, superhost, WMIS, clothing allowances, and a completion bonus. But here's the thing, it didn't improve the outcomes. The best outcomes within the entire program history were the very first 2 or 3 groups, when there were no bells and whistles. It was a stripped down program. But what was unique about it, what was rich, what was great about it, was the integrity model that was being implemented with the youth. So that's something, again, that's a traditional way of responding to what we call at-risk or traumatized individuals. That's a traditional way. It's also a very time-consuming way and a very expensive way to do it. We had the most significant barriers in the first cycle of the youth that we worked with the fewest bells and whistles, no incentives whatsoever, and that's where the highest outcomes were. You see, this is where Einstein's saying you can never solve a problem in the same paradigm in which it was created. You have to move this upward, downward. You have to see it differently. It's like the old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. It's kind of like, traditionally speaking, what society does oftentimes is they lead the horse to water, and then the horse doesn't want to drink. And then, instead of asking the right question, which is, why isn't the horse drinking? They just keep changing the water. They keep bringing the horse to the water, and they keep changing the flavor of the water and all this kind of stuff. It gets very time consuming, very expensive, but at the end of the day, the horse doesn't drink because either A, they're not asking the right question, or maybe they're afraid to ask the question. Why isn't this horse drinking? In other words, the real question was, what impact does trauma have on employability? A person's capacity to become employed. When you look at what it takes to become employed, it's significant, especially with the way that the labor market has changed over the last couple of decades. It's a fast-moving labor market. You can't, there's no such thing as hardly a seniority or getting the gold watch or whatever it is. Consistency and stability is not what it used to be. So it really kind of means you have to have a significant amount of emotional resiliency and really a deeper sense of purpose of who you are and what you've got to offer to the world in order to withstand the instability of the labor market. So the work really needed to be done at that level. So again, though, this is part and parcel of what trauma can look like. Trauma can look like chronic unemployment, but actually what you might be dealing with there is all sorts of different anxieties, sensitivities, people being triggered by certain events. All these things can start to show up. And what it will look like on the surface is that the person says they want to find work. But underneath that, the person actually has a number of different defenses and barriers set up that, if you will, get in the way. It's kind of a love-hate relationship with work. If, for instance, if somebody was traumatized at the hand of another person, which is often the case, this person may very well have some issues with, being part of a team, getting close to other people. This person will have some, maybe have withdrawn, or maybe they've become, kind of hypersensitive to things. So there can be a lot of reasons subconsciously why this person isn't working or is unable to maintain work, or won't show up for appointments, or continues to go to interviews but is unsuccessful. There can be many factors at play that is actually undermining the entire process. But if you don't see those things, then what happens is you keep changing the flavor of the water for the horse, but the horse still isn't going to drink, even though the horse says it's thirsty. Does this make some sense? This is what it can look like. If you've got somebody who says, wow, I'd really love to have a job. I really need a job. And then you might have somebody, you're a case manager or what have you, and going, great, this person seems to be motivated, right? And maybe you schedule them to show up to the resume, workshop, or the interview skills workshop, or the transferable skills workshop, or whatever it is. They're signed up for those workshops and they don't show for whatever reasons. Those reasons can even look legitimate. But at the end of the day, when you see the pattern, there's something else going on. Now, if you knew something else was going on, would you continue to sign the person up for workshops? Absolutely not. It would make no sense. Why keep leading the horse to water when they're not going to drink? You've got to resolve this at a different level. So being able to understand how trauma, and I'm using that word very loosely. That is just a huge umbrella word for lots of different kinds of traumas that can occur. And so being informed, being aware of how that's going to show up in a person's ability to seek and maintain employment is very important. But the piece of the conversation that I uniquely bring to this is the stuff around entitlement and indulgence. Now, when you look into the issue of trauma, what you're going to find when we look deep, and this is where the depth psychology stuff comes in, is you're going to find that within the core of the human psyche, there is what I often refer to as the immature golden child. It's the part of us that is extremely narcissistic, egocentric, and grandiose. In other words, that's what we call infantile. We start out our lives as infants. And we are infantile. We think the world should revolve around us, and we think we're pretty darn special. And because we're pretty darn special, we're godlike. And consequently, we feel very highly entitled. Now, this is a really, really big discussion, and I would love to share more with you guys in your own teams, and I'd love to do presentations for you, etc., and explain more of this. But to make a very long story, very worthwhile story, it's an incredible, how all this works in the psyche. But just to say that if anybody feels strongly entitled to a certain thing and they don't get it, two things are going to happen right away. One, the person is going to feel hurt that they did not get what they feel entitled to. And secondly, they're going to be angry because they did not get what they felt entitled to. So whenever we feel hurt, we become defensive. We set up fences and barriers. That's usually the first thing. There's a victim story sitting under there. There's a victim story that sits there. That'll usually be the first story that is seen. So when somebody experiences something traumatic, then there'll be this feeling of hurt or victimization. That's the victim story. The reason why I lack confidence is because, and they'll say something about a mother or father who hurt them or abused them or didn't show up, or something happened to cause them to now lack, for instance, confidence. Just underneath that victim story, there's the story of revenge. So in other words, I often say to people, if somebody broke into your house and they stole something precious from you, You know, you would feel violated, you would feel hurt, and you would probably want back what was taken from you. In other words, you'd want some form of justice. I said, but really, now, once your hurt kind of evaporates a bit, wouldn't you also be mad? Wouldn't you know? Now, this wouldn't. When I'm talking angry, because you feel so deeply violated. What would you? What would that anger look like? What would you want? You wouldn't want justice, would you? You would want revenge. You would want back what was taken from you plus interest. So what you're going to see as a trauma response is two things. You're going to see hurt and defensiveness, and then you're going to see revenge and offensiveness. Now, what we want to keep in mind there is that a good defense can also be a good offense, and a good offense can also be a good defense. But you're going to see victim story and then revenge. Now, when we're little, or even sometimes when we're bigger, but a lot of this trauma stuff happens when we're little. When we're little, we don't have a lot of ways to even the playing field to get back at people. So one of the best ways we as human beings have figured out to get back at somebody who we feel has hurt us is to withhold our love and affection. We actually punish people by withholding ourselves. Now this isn't far-fetched, is it? It happens all the time. It happens in adult relationships. Your spouse or somebody says something to you, that angers you, and we'll often ignore our spouse. So we'll withhold communication. Or we won't want to touch them, or we won't want to show any affection. It's and what we say to ourselves is, well, I can't, I'm not able to do that right now because I feel hurt. That's what I was saying, because a good defense is also a good offense. If you really want to hurt somebody, withholding love and affection is one of the deadliest weapons that we have in our arsenal as human beings. Now, this being said, I recently went to a presentation by a psychologist. She's very well known, very well versed in the area of attachment theory. And she was citing a study basically saying that for human beings, that we are so wired for attachment that, if you will, push come to shove, we would choose attachment over food. That as a human being, we are so hungry for attachment. We need to be attached to other people so significantly, we would rather starve than go without attachment. That's how strong that drive is. So you have to keep that in mind here. Conversely, if you will, or on the other side of that coin, when we really want to hurt somebody, we threaten them with the breaking of an attachment, with the withdrawal of attachment, love and affection. The thing about it is, when it comes to employment, is that oftentimes a lot of employment is about being of service to other people. It's about being friendly. It's about being warm. It's about being inviting. It's about conversing with. It's about being a normal human being, capable of healthy attachment. That's an incredibly important part of getting employment, isn't it? I mean, in order to do well in an interview, you've got to be able to connect with the interviewers. You've got to both present, the technically correct answers, but also be personable. It's very important in the workplace as well. And all those folks I mentioned earlier who could get employment but couldn't keep it, this is their issue. They had a problem connecting with people. Other people who are chronically unemployed, they couldn't get to an interview. or what have you. And all those are traditional signs of trauma, but at the same time, it's also a result of inflamed entitlement and indulgence. What is an indulgence? Well, indulgence is a free will choice to participate in any thought, process, or thing that creates adverse consequences. So adverse consequences, we could say, are our unemployment. That's pretty adverse, right? To be able to look at that consequence, to be able to look at that outcome as an indulgence, as a free will choice, is really where this conversation starts to take people deeper. As I mentioned earlier, this was the conversation that I had to have with myself. These were the insights that I had to have for myself in order to break free of what I had gotten myself trapped into. So if you're out there as a career practitioner or a vocational therapist and you're working with somebody who has experienced trauma, or you're a career practitioner or you're an employment counselor and you're seeing somebody who's gone from agency to agency, from program to program, who you've put through a number of different workshops and they just aren't moving forward, suspect a trauma history, and that's definitely, worth shining some light into. But then there's another conversation to have, and that's the conversation about entitlement and indulgence. That's the conversation about how this person might actually be, if you will, creating their own demise by withholding, if you will, their talents. Now, you might think that that's an outrageous statement to make, and I appreciate that that might be your sentiment. But I've been doing this work and following this line of study and in this discipline for 27 years, and I can tell you it has never failed to be there. I've applied it to myself in areas where I've found chronic issues going on in my own life and have found it to be true. But as I say to my clients, it's like I'm a big believer in the truth will set you free, but it is a bit like a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways. But I guarantee you, when somebody's stuck in these cycles, they already feel stung. They already feel hurt. We all know, right? It's kind of goes back to the old saying, no pain, no gain. So, that's what the sword of truth is like. It cuts, but you experience freedom. And I don't know about you, but I'm all about freedom. I want people to be free to experience all that life has to offer. But if you're working with folks who have a history of trauma, this is going to be alive and well in them. If you're working with people who have again, chronic unemployment issues, suspect trauma and suspect the entitlement and indulgence dynamic to be magnified and alive and well in them. You might even have people in your life who kind of have the whole employment thing nailed down, but what's going to happen is they're going to have entitlement and indulgence dynamics go on in other areas of their life that are going to cause adverse consequences. So it could be health problems, it could be mental health problems, it could be marital issues, it could be domestic issues, it could be challenges raising their children, whatever it is. That phenomena of entitlement and indulgence is going to show up elsewhere, which will very likely impact their employment and maintaining and being able to maintain employment. So this is very tricky how all this stuff goes on. But I would love to share more with you about it. Now, this is the approach that I use every Tuesday night in my parent leadership group. In fact, I'm leaving here in just a few minutes to go do tonight's group. So if you or anybody you just have a hunch that this is going on for them, this entitlement indulgence piece, they likely have trauma in their history, they would probably do well to come to this group. This particular group is is Tuesday nights in Surrey, British Columbia. It's open to the public and it's free. Um, um, and I'm also available to to help get groups off the ground in your area. Um, and just contact me and we can begin a discussion on how to have that happen. Um, so again, I appreciate you tuning in. Again, I just wanted to kind of kind of revisit my roots as an employment and career counselor. Um, and well, that's my buzzer right there. It's time for me to head off to my group. So have a wonderful day, and I look forward to hearing from you. Take care.